Hello, romance lovers. Today I have a story for you called Since When Were You the Villain? Don't forget to support this video with a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new interesting stories. Thank you for watching. It was a dark night outside. The sky was strewn with bright stars, softly illuminating the majestic mansion with its exquisite carvings and tall towers. Its walls seemed mysterious and enigmatic against the night sky. Suddenly, a muffled voice broke the silence, full of realization and slight regret. "Oh, I'm caught." A girl in a beautiful pink dress with long brown hair stood, frightened, at the door. Her face was pale and her mouth was wide open in fear. The first two letters of the name of the person in front of her came out of her mouth and she froze, unable to move. She felt her gaze meet a shadow hidden in a black cloak standing right in front of her. The man took off his hood, and it was a handsome guy. His coal-colored hair fell softly over his face, and his red eyes, which matched each other perfectly, gave him a mysterious and attractive look, as if he was part of the night. He looked amazing, as if he was not of this world. The girl asked if it was him. And yes, his name was Killian. The girl, realizing who it was, became even more frightened. The blood inside her was boiling, and her heart was pounding as if it was about to burst out of her chest. From the strong shock, she dropped the glass. Pressing her back against the wall, she could barely hold her breath and, with a trembling voice, wanted to ask what he was doing here. But she was interrupted. The guy manfully pressed the girl against the wall, covering her with himself, and deftly caught the falling glass. He looked calm while she trembled under him, feeling his strength and confidence. His eyes did not express either anger or fear, but only cold confidence when he quietly asked, "Do you want to wake everyone up, Sophie?" He pulled away from the girl and looked at her with a small smirk, saying that his mouth was dry. Bringing the glass closer to himself, he tilted it slightly, as if hinting that he wanted to drink. His gaze was cold, but there was some kind of play in it, making her heart beat faster. The silence between them became noticeable. Killian lifted the glass to his mouth and began to drink the water, his movements calm and confident. He wore black gloves on his hands, which emphasized the cold severity of his image. Each gesture seemed deliberate, as if he was controlling everything around him, including her reaction, after which he put the glass on the table. They were on the balcony, and the girl tried to look at his face, but because he was much taller than her, she had to tilt her head back a little. It was night, and there was a terrifying silence between them, which seemed to press on her, making her feel every nerve in her body. The girl looked at her hand in horror and noticed something terrible that was barely visible in the dark night. It made her nervous, and anxiety instantly covered her like cold sweat. Fear was visible in her eyes, and her heart began to beat faster. There was blood on her hand. The girl stared at it in horror, feeling anxiety gradually taking over her entire body. Drops were slowly trickling down her skin, and she couldn't understand how this could have happened. The girl turned to the door, about to run. There was horror in her eyes, and her heart was beating faster and faster, as if it was about to burst out of her chest. In a panic, she rushed to the door, hurrying and screaming for a doctor, her voice trembling with fear. Killian grabbed Sophie's arm manfully, stopping her. His grip was strong but not cruel, and there was a determined look in his eyes. He wouldn't let her go, knowing that panicking would only make things worse. He slowly approached her face, his eyes never leaving hers. Every movement he made was calm, as if he was in control of everything around him. The girl felt her breathing quicken and her heart pounding in her chest. The guy, holding her by one hand, kissed her quite tenderly, but at the same time roughly, which shocked the girl. All her feelings were mixed up. Her body could not understand how to react, and chaos reigned in her head. She froze, unable to react to what had happened. Their lips touched each other, and the girl's own thoughts made her feel embarrassed, causing her to blush a little. Everything that was happening seemed unreal to her, and she couldn't figure out how to react to this moment. Pulling away, they looked into each other's eyes. It was a mesmerizing and mysterious moment, filled with tension, like the night itself, in which time seemed to stand still. He looked at her tenderly and said, "Forget everything you saw today, Sophie." The moon was shining beautifully behind the guy, its soft light illuminating his figure, giving everything that was happening even more mystery. The girl looked at him in surprise, not expecting such a turn of events. Confusion and bewilderment were visible in her eyes, but the guy had already managed to turn around and, not paying attention to her reaction, took a step back. The guy had already sat down on the balcony railing as if he was about to leave. Sophie stood frozen, her heart beating faster. She didn't know what to do, but the feeling that she had to stop him overcame her. He jumped off the railing, and the girl, unable to bear it, rushed towards him, peering into the darkness, trying to make out his silhouette. With a trembling voice, she shouted, "Wait!" Her words echoed in the silence of the night, but the guy was already far away, not stopping. The girl looked carefully into the forest, but he was no longer there. He literally disappeared into the darkness. She was struck by the thought of where this young man could have gone. As if he had dissolved into thin air, leaving only a strange feeling of uncertainty and anxiety. The girl sat down on the floor in confusion, her body trembling and tears were gathering in her eyes. Her gaze was full of fear, as if the world around her had suddenly changed, and she could not find her place in it. Everything that was happening seemed absurd, but at the same time real, and she did not know how to cope with it. Sophie pressed her hand to herself and, looking at the floor, thought about her own. Thoughts were spinning in her head, not giving her peace. It couldn't be that she was so mistaken. She realized that this guy was not the main male character in her story. At some point, her thoughts seemed to clear up. Opening her eyes, Sophie saw a strange ceiling. It was unusual. Her head was buzzing and her body felt heavy, as if she could not fully return to reality. The girl lay on the bed in surprise, feeling her heart beat faster. The ceiling above her seemed painfully familiar, but at the same time alien. This feeling was disturbing, making her wonder where she was and how she got here. After a moment of thought, it dawned on her and she froze in amazement. Could this really have happened to her? Her mind refused to believe what was happening, and her heart sank with anxiety. Everything seemed so unreal, as if it was a dream from which she could not wake up. She found herself in stories she had read many times. Everything around her resembled the pages of her favorite novels, which were her only hobby and consolation. The girl could not believe that the world she knew only from books had now become reality, and she was a part of it. For several years, 100 to 201 brought her great happiness. She spent it on novels, which became her little world. The girl enjoyed stories wherever she could get her phone, at home, at school, on the street. These moments were her refuge, giving her peace and inspiration. And she always thought that novellas were like a box of chocolates. You never know what's inside. And once the chocolates are gone, you'll want to buy more, because the taste of history always leaves a mark and calls for the next portion of emotions. So she looked through a lot of works to make sure of their quality. And finally, she became a time traveler. But instead of fear or confusion, she felt joy. However, it was predictable. Who, if not a fan of novels, should find themselves in the very center of one of their favorite stories? For her, it was like a dream come true. The girl thought about it with embarrassment because this thought did not cause her fear, but pride. She felt that her dreams, which seemed so distant, had suddenly become reality. And instead of being afraid, she began to think about how best to use this unexpected chance. One of the secrets of survival in a novel is to learn everything from the maid. After all, the maid, as a rule, is in every story, like an integral part of the plot. She knows all the secrets, customs, and events that can become the key to understanding the new world. If she is a time traveler, then of course she knows what to do. One of the obligatory elements of her story is the moment when she finds minerals. This discovery should have become her key to wealth and success, allowing her to take a strong position in the new world. Further, the girl, realizing all the peculiarities of her situation, understands that she needs to establish romantic relationships with the main and secondary characters. This will not only help her integrate into the new world, but will also give her the opportunity to influence the development of events, strengthening her position and ensuring her protection. And finally, according to the signature scenario, the girl must get ahead of the villain using information that only she, the time traveler, has. Knowledge of the future and events that have not yet happened becomes her main weapon, allowing her not only to avoid the threat, but also to change the course of history in her favor. She stood up and sat on the bed, feeling her thoughts gradually come into order. First of all, she needed to understand what novella she was in and who exactly she was in this world. Understanding her role and position in history became the most important task for her to act correctly from now on. She looked around and noticed an old mirror hanging on the wall. It was not surprising. In such worlds, such antique things are often found. The girl wiped it from dust, and as soon as the mirror was clean again, she admired it. The reflection was bright and clear, and she wanted to look at herself from a new side. She looked quite beautiful. Light brown hair, emerald eyes, and fair skin. All of this was created harmoniously in her image, as if her features were cut from nature itself. She was wearing a long, beautiful green skirt, and on top of that, a simple blouse with a green bow. There was something simple and elegant about her image at the same time. The girl was so beautiful that her description could go on forever. She thought, looking at herself in the mirror, maybe she was the main character of this story? After all, she was so attractive that even she herself could not help but feel how her appearance perfectly fits the role that she might have to play. With these thoughts, she stood in front of the mirror for a long time, unable to tear her gaze away. She was fascinated by herself. Her own reflection seemed so incredible that at some point it seemed to her that everything around her was just part of her dream. And yet, pulling herself together, she asked irritably, "So who am I?" This thought tormented her, giving her no peace. She felt that despite her appearance and mysterious position, she still did not understand her role in this new world. She started thinking. Yes, she was beautiful, but all the heroines in novels were like that. Brown hair, green eyes. These were two common features for heroines. She tried to find something that could distinguish her from others, but so far her thoughts did not lead to a clear answer. She fell to the ground, panicked, and began to think in disarray about who she was. Usually, brown-haired girls in novels are Marie from The Capable Maid or Alkiris from The Melody of the Dead Forest. She tried to find at least some signs in herself that could indicate her role in this story, but everything seemed too confusing and uncertain. She had no idea who she was. She clutched her head, nervous, because she read hundreds of novels a month, and now she couldn't remember what the heroines looked like. All those images that she knew so well now became foreign and blurry to her. The girl needed more clues. She felt that at least a name could help her remember what kind of story she was in. But how could she do that? She began to think that she could try to find clues in the world around her, talk to someone, or pay attention to details that could give her away. She began to look around. Around her was a rather old house with a wooden floor that seemed to have not seen repairs for a long time. The walls were white, but cracks were noticeable on them, and traces of time were visible on the window frames. The ceiling was quite low, creating a feeling of confined space. On the floor stood an old, slightly dirty, creaky bed, which seemed to have not been used for a long time. She was embarrassed by the bed, because it was on it that she woke up. Then she noticed a small table with an old book of objects on it, covered in dust. There was an uncomfortable chair next to it. Everything in the room indicated that there had been no guests or hosts here for a long time, which added to the feeling of isolation and strange emptiness. She looked around in surprise. How could this be? Where was the grand estate she had expected to see? And where were the servants who were supposed to serve such luxury? Everything around her seemed at odds with what she had expected to find in a world that was supposed to be filled with grandeur and sophistication. The girl tried to calm herself down, reminding herself that this kind of thing happened quite often in romantic novels. This thought consoled her a little, allowing her to distract herself from panic and focus on finding answers. Sometimes the main characters start their story in the most humble conditions, only to find themselves in the center of a luxurious world. And having overcome all the difficulties, they finally achieve their happy ending. This thought cheered her up a little, reminding her that every story is a journey full of trials and unexpected turns. Still, the thought that the maid would come and explain everything calmed her down a little. But the girl was a quick and impatient person enough to just sit and wait. She understood that she had to act herself. She looked around and noticed a book on the table, covered in dust. However, despite the dust, it did not look old. Its cover was almost new, without cracks or scuffs. This seemed strange to the girl, and this book turned out to be the heroine's personal diary. For the newcomer, it was literally a treasure trove of information. Through the pages of the diary, she could learn everything about the life of her new role, her past, her relationships with others. The girl opened the first page with trepidation, realizing that this diary was her key to survival in this world. The girl picked up the book, thinking that the more details there were around it, the more important her role in this story should be. Feeling a little nervous, she opened the diary. Having barely opened the first page, her gaze fell on the letter carefully placed inside. This find amazed her, and guesses immediately began to spin in her head. Who left it and why? The letter turned out to be addressed to a guy named Killian. The girl froze when she read his name. It turned out he was an Archduke. This discovery stunned her, because now she understood that this mysterious man she met that night played a key role in this story. And indeed, his name, complex and long, was perfect for the main male character. And the fact that he was an Archduke only confirmed her guess. Sophie felt a slight thrill. She found herself in the center of a story where this man, without a doubt, played one of the key roles. From the letter, the girl learned that by decision of the imperial family, they were engaged, and it was a marriage of convenience. Sophie was stunned. She had never seen her fiancé. This meant that he was quite heartless, and it seemed deliberately avoided her. This fact made her think about her future relationship with him and what awaited her in this marriage. The girl, reading the letter to Killian, realized that it said that perhaps he was disappointed with her situation. After all, he was an Archduke who owned the northern territories, and she was just a girl who had found herself in this world, but he did not even know it. She knew that a marriage like theirs was more political than personal, but despite everything, this engagement was necessary for Sophie. She read these words on the sheet, realizing that it was this marriage with Killian that would open the doors to a new world for her, full of opportunities, but also dangers. Deep down, she knew that this engagement was her chance to survive and find her place in this story. Heroine, Sophia Frau, and the cold Archduke of the North, Killian Viprons Rivellon, a humiliated girl and an arrogant man, a classic combination for a novella, where destinies intertwine in a complex and tense relationship. This twist was so obvious that it seemed predictable, but it also contained the potential for dramatic events. The girl dropped the letter and sat down on the floor, thinking. She couldn't remember such a novel because names like Sophia Frau and Killian Viprons Rivellon, they come up too often. Her thoughts were confused, but she knew she had to learn more to understand what world she was in and what awaited her. The girl decided to pull herself together because she had enough information to figure out the situation. She understood that the main thing was to stay calm and use her knowledge to survive and find her way in this new world. All that was left for her was to understand how to use this knowledge and find a way to turn the circumstances to her advantage. She began to wonder why her heroine needed an engagement ordered by the imperial family. Perhaps it was part of a political game, or perhaps this marriage opened up important opportunities for her to advance in society. But why exactly did she need such a union? Perhaps with this engagement, she was trying to escape from her home, from this old attic where she had spent so much time. The engagement to the Archduke could be her chance to break out of the tight, oppressive confines of her past, to start a new life and find freedom. Killian agreed to the engagement at the Emperor's command, seeing it as a political move rather than a personal desire. For him, it was a duty, and for her, a chance to change her life. But he did not communicate with his bride at all, which meant that the man was callous and was not interested in the woman at all. The next action of the heroine, Sophie, was already clear. The next step of the heroine, Sophie, was decisive. She decided to break off the engagement. If her life was to change, she was not going to put up with Killian's cold attitude. She understood that this step could be risky, but she could not stay in this position any longer. But let's not forget that the main rule of romantic novels is that relationships often begin at the very moment when someone decides to break off an engagement or propose a divorce. It is at these moments that the heroes begin to realize their true emotions, and their mutual struggle becomes the driving force for the development of their relationship. After Kiliana's behavior, Sophie decides to break off the engagement and return to her parents, realizing that her happiness cannot depend on such a person. Killian growled like a beast and moved towards Sophie with a sharp movement. His eyes blazed with fury as he declared that his bride would not go anywhere. It was a moment that could not be missed, a plot that has become an integral part of every romantic novel. He falls in love, and despite his coldness and detachment, Killian realizes that he cannot afford to break off the engagement. In the end, the heroine finds her true love in him, because the Archduke will definitely not agree to a breakup. She called out the window for her fiancé to be waiting, happy with how well everything was going according to her predictable plan. But after a few moments, doubts began to plague her. She felt her heart tighten. Maybe she had jumped to conclusions, and the consequences of her words would be much more complicated than she had imagined. She screamed so loudly that her head spun, and she sat on the bed rail, laughing a little at herself. The rays of the sun softly illuminated the room, creating a feeling of warmth and coziness. She looked at herself in the reflection and was a little surprised. The internal tension she was experiencing seemed to leave no trace on her appearance, but her arm was too thin. Of course, the heroines of novels often eat nothing but desserts, but this was clearly too much, the girl thought, feeling that her body was too weak and even standing was difficult. An anxious thought flashed through her mind. Was she really on the verge of death? This question did not give her peace, and anxiety increasingly took hold of her heart. The thought that her condition was so bad literally terrified her. Her body did not obey her, and every breath was difficult. The girl felt fear pierce her, as if she was losing control of herself and her body. While thinking about her own, the girl suddenly heard the door open behind her. She quickly turned around, expecting to see who dared to disturb her peace. She turned around and saw the maid, which was not surprising, but the girl did not allow her to come in. The maid seemed not to notice this and crossed the threshold. The maid asked in a displeased voice what she was doing there, holding a tray with food for the girl. The maid did not look very pretty, although she was young, and her face expressed obvious displeasure. She placed the tray of food on the table, but the food itself did not look very appetizing. There was something indistinct and nondescript on the plate, and the smell was not very enticing. The girl looked at the food in surprise, not expecting to see such food prepared by the servants. It was terrible. The products looked unappetizing, and the presentation itself left much to be desired. Sophie was literally irritated by such food. There was either pepper or a fly floating in the soup, and the bread was covered in mold, which looked completely unappetizing. And yet, she remembered novels where the servants completely ignore the heroine, so perhaps her situation was not so bad. Sophie, having gathered her strength, turned to the maid, who stood at the door with an air of displeasure. She stood up and, a little embarrassed, asked, "What is your name?" The maid's name was Jenny, and when she heard the question, her expression changed slightly, as if she was thinking, "Why does she need my name?" Jenny stood silently, watching Sophie, as if waiting for her to say next. The girl turned to her again, asking if she should eat it. There was uncertainty in her voice, and her eyes were full of doubt. Jenny looked at the tray, then at her, silently. The maid, with joy on her face but obvious irritation in her voice, replied that of course she was always responsible for the girl's food, and added that it was her duty. The girl looked at the maid and, frowning, quietly said that she found it hard to believe that she was actually engaged to the Archduke. There was a hint of anger in her voice. The girl looked at the gloating maid in surprise. She said that she didn't think that she would be respected because of the engagement. Although Sophie was engaged, she had never seen him. They were engaged on paper, since Sophie and Killian got engaged, but the man had not visited his fiancée even once. This only increased her doubts and misunderstanding of what was really going on in their relationship. The maid told the girl that if she wanted to be a real mistress, she needed to go out and start living with him. But Jenny doubted that Killian would agree to such a step. The girl thought anxiously inside herself about what to do next. She couldn't figure out whether to continue waiting or to take action. Thoughts about how the situation was getting worse every day flashed through her mind, and she felt that she couldn't remain inactive. No matter how you look at it, it was strange when she was ignored, because she was the fiancée of the Archduke. In such cases, it was necessary to ask the maid one more question. The girl said, "I am the lady of the County of Fraus. Why are you humiliating me?" The letter did not say why Sophie was unhappy. The maid, hearing her question, asked again, "The lady of the County of Fraus." Jenny laughed, clutching her stomach from laughter, and said, "Do you think you're Fraus? Because I called you mistress?" These words were addressed to Sophie. She could not hide her contemptuous smirk, looking at the girl who, in her opinion, imagined herself so much. The girl knew that the maid was a walking reference book, and she would definitely tell her everything she needed. So Sophie, unable to resist, decided to ask what was so funny about her words. She looked at Jenny with bewilderment and calmly, but with obvious curiosity, said, "What's funny here?" Jenny replied with a touch of sarcasm that she was sorry, but if the mistress had been a little stricter, she wouldn't be here. It sounded like an unexpected accusation, but the girl, despite this, continued to listen attentively. Every word the maid said formed one big riddle in her head, which she was going to solve, and finally it was time for an explanation. Sophie lost her mother as a child, and since then her life has changed. Her stepmother and younger brother began to oppress her, which added to her pain and despair. Sophie always felt unwanted in her family, and this became the cause of her internal struggle. This novella was reminiscent of Cinderella, but with changed details. Instead of stepsisters, there was a younger brother, and the stepmother was no less cruel. The heroine's life was full of humiliation and despair, as if fate itself had decided to test her strength. All this made her situation even more hopeless. The maid poked Sophie in the forehead with her finger and grinned, noting that it was only because of her illness that the girl did not clean or wash, but that was no reason to expect that she would be carried in arms. In conclusion, she teasingly called her mistress, emphasizing this word with special mockery. Sophie thought about it and came to the conclusion that her heroine really seemed to be a real Cinderella, forced to do all the dirty work in the house. The girl reluctantly confirmed the maid's words, but without showing it, she went to the table and picked up a plate of soup with a fly floating in it. A cunning plan had already been born in her head, which was supposed to teach a lesson to those who dared to treat her like that. Sophie smiled reservedly, looking at the maid. "I know everything perfectly well myself," she said with cold confidence, and then abruptly turned the bowl of soup right on Jenny's head. Hot liquid and bits of food ran down her face while the maid stood in complete shock, unable to utter a word. The maid was horrified, her hands instinctively reaching for her head, feeling the hot liquid and pieces of food. Her eyes were blazing with anger, and she asked, choking with anger, "What are you doing?" Her voice sounded with a hint of rage, but her eyes still remained incomprehensible of what was happening. The girl wanted to add a little drama, but accidentally said her thoughts out loud. A little drama?" The maid, shocked, stuttered and asked again. She thought to herself that it was a necessary cliché of novels. The time traveler had to be given some drama to grab the reader's attention. She looked at the maid happily and cheerfully and asked why she had been so obedient all this time, because she didn't have to do that at all. Sophie tilted her head slightly to the side, expecting the maid to somehow explain her behavior, but her eyes sparkled with genuine curiosity. The maid with the bowl on her head watched her angrily, her face red with anger. She was about to say something, but there was a clear conflict in her eyes. For a moment, everything froze, and the tension in the room became almost tangible. Sophie was really angry. She didn't understand how her father could leave his daughter just because his wife died. How could he do that? Abandon her to her fate, not caring about her happiness and well-being? Questions swarmed in the girl's head, and each of them was full of pain and bewilderment. The mistress began to shout that she had a gentle nature and endured all this like a saint. But the maid, raising her eyebrows in bewilderment, did not understand since when her mistress became a saint. She stood before her, as if expecting an explanation, and her face expressed obvious doubt in such words. Jenny still looked at this whole picture with horror and thought that Sophie had been ill for too long and apparently had gone crazy. Her gaze was full of bewilderment, and she could not understand what was happening to the girl who, it would seem, had recently been calm and reserved. And the girl, with an angry expression on her face, thought that a real heroine would never do such a thing. She could not believe that she found herself in such a situation, where her patience and weakness were used against her. If you look at her letters, you can understand a lot, but one thing stood out. It was not just a form of communication, but a hidden pain embedded in the words. Each letter seemed to scream that the heroine was alone, that her life was full of torment and fear. To describe her briefly, she was depressed and unhappy. Her gaze often reflected an internal struggle, and her movements, the weariness of a life full of adversity. Every word she said sounded with a note of despair, as if she was trying to find strength in herself, but still felt how life slipped through her fingers. The girl looked at the maid angrily and, clenching her fists, said that if she dared to do this to her again, she would not leave it without consequences. Her eyes were burning with a bright fire, and her voice sounded with such force that even the maid felt anxiety seize her. Now there is no need to worry, because the time traveler is already here, and she is ready to take her fate into her own hands. With each passing day, she became more and more determined, and the world around her became more and more predictable. Sophie, now your life path will be in flowers, or rather in champagne, sparkling, bright, and full of surprises. In this world, you will have to go through many trials, but each of them will become a step towards your own happiness, albeit with a slight taste of surprises and mysteries. The girl looked around and noticed several buildings, among which was something that looked like a castle and a cozy estate. The well-kept garden, exotic trees, luxurious buildings. All this caused the girl to feel confused and surprised. She did not expect to see such magnificence in this place. Life here seemed completely different, not like in her previous world. The glittering ceilings, gold decor looked beautiful, creating an atmosphere of grandeur and luxury. Every element in this place seemed carefully thought out, and the space was filled with a sense of delight and at the same time easy living. Such a domain. And she, Sophie, living in the attic in a cramped room. It seemed incredible to her, especially in such luxury. She thought that perhaps it was time to meet her stepmother and understand why her situation had changed so much, and what to do next. The girl opened the door and attracted the attention of the maids who, noticing her, stopped, clearly surprised by her appearance. Sophie felt everyone's gaze sharpening, but she was not going to stop. One of the maids turned to her with bewilderment. "What are you doing here?" Zrenya, her voice was cold as usual, but there was still some surprise in her eyes. The girl felt the tension in the air growing. The lady asked the maid where her mother was, to which she smirked and mockingly replied, "Mama?" Her voice was not only mocking, but also somewhat hostile. The maid said coldly, "Your mother is dead." Sophie froze, not expecting such directness. She looked at the maid in surprise, not understanding how she could so confidently and without any remorse touch on such a personal topic. The life of a despised heroine turned out to be very tiring for the girl. Every day was full of disappointments and insults, and despite her outward benevolence, she felt the full weight of her situation. The girl looked at the maid with irritation and said that she was not talking about her mother, but about the countess. Hearing these words, the maid's face suddenly changed. From confidence, it began to express excitement, and her eyes darted from side to side as if she did not know how to answer correctly. And then the girl heard a rough female voice screaming, calling her. It shocked her. The voice was so sharp and commanding that it made everything inside her tremble. Sophie immediately felt uneasy, and she felt tension grip her body. Seeing this woman, their countess, all the maids quickly bowed to her, trying to show their respect. Her majestic posture and stern gaze instantly subdued everyone present, emphasizing her power in this house. The girl turned around and, as if meeting the gaze of the Lucifer of this estate himself, looked at the countess. Her stern gaze and icy aura inspired awe. Even without saying a word, the countess seemed to demand submission. The countess's name was Ruby Zell Fraus. Her bright red hair shimmered in the light, creating the appearance of a fiery crown. Her pale skin contrasted with her yellow eyes. She was wearing a dark red dress. Apparently, this woman was the stepmother the maid had spoken of, and because of which the girl lived in the attic, far from everyone. Behind the stepmother stood that same maid, Jenny, who smiled maliciously, clearly enjoying the moment. It seemed that she had already managed to complain about Sophie, and now she was waiting for retribution. The girl frowned. She could not stand snitching, but decided that this complaint at least saved her time, because sooner or later she would have to face her stepmother anyway. The first villain's behavior was painfully predictable, as is expected in such stories. But this only fueled the excitement in the soul of the traveler. Sophie decided that it was time to show everyone what she was capable of. These thoughts brought her a strange satisfaction, like the anticipation of an imminent victory. The countess looked at her stepdaughter with a cold smile, her yellow eyes flashing with an unkind light. She said that sick people should not have so much energy, clearly hinting at Sophie's prank. Then, without waiting for an answer, the countess sharply asked if it was really she who had spilled soup on the maid. There was anger in her voice, and her face expressed displeasure. Sophie happily and easily answered her stepmother, saying that it was not soup at all but food waste, with an unperturbed look. She smiled slightly, watching the countess's reaction. The stepmother began to scream. She clearly did not like her stepdaughter's behavior. However, despite her rage, she tried to maintain the appearance of mercy and told Sophie about it. But the girl, unabashed, spread her hands and with a slight mocking tone replied that her countess had simply chosen the wrong word. After that, the girl added that the word hatred would be much more appropriate. These words seriously angered the countess. Her face turned pale with anger, and she clenched her fists. But nevertheless, she tried to maintain her cold and arrogant appearance. The girl took a step closer to her stepmother, showing neither fear nor doubt. Sophie said with determination that she was indeed ill, but with such a diet she would not be able to recover. These words angered the countess even more, who responded by clenching her fists furiously, trying to contain her anger, but her face still showed irritation. The girl stepped closer to the maid, and without looking away, calmly reported that there were flies in the soup. Then, with obvious mockery, she turned to the countess. "Don't you think that such nonsense disgraces our county?" The stepmother, clenching her fists in rage, her face expressed anger, but she tried to maintain her dignity, not showing complete panic. The girl, seeing how her stepmother was holding back her anger, decided to add fuel to the fire. Smiling but with obvious mockery, she asked, "You brought her here to punish her, right?" Her words sounded like a challenge, and with each question, her stepmother lost the rest of her composure, but she held on, trying not to show her weakness. The countess, unable to contain her rage, was already shouting at the poor girl. But Sophie, noticing that she could not be defeated by words, quickly began to think of another plan. She decided to take advantage of the situation to manipulate her stepmother's emotions. New ideas began to appear in her head on how to use her weaknesses and insecurities against her. The stepmother, unable to control her rage, swung at the girl. Sophie, noticing her intentions, calmly asked, "Aren't you going to hit me?" While placing her hand on her hip, as if demonstrating self-confidence. However, despite her calmness, the countess still struck, relying on her aggression. The girl did not stop despite the blow. She stepped back slightly and began to state her wishes with cold calm. "I want to change my room," she said in a confident voice. "The attic is too hot in the summer and too cold in the winter. She thinks there is a corner for me in this large estate." The countess glared at the girl and began to shout that she had become completely impudent after her engagement to the Archduke. Sophie, surprised by this statement, could not believe that her stepmother had reacted so unexpectedly. For the countess, it was impudent that a family member, much less the Archduke's fiancé, wanted to live in the county estate as if it were her right. Sophie pondered this in amazement, not understanding why her request to change rooms had caused such a storm of emotion. After all, didn't she have a right to comfort, given her position? The girl decided to go against her stepmother and, with a slight grin, said that if you think about it, she doesn't have any Frau's blood at all. These words infuriated the woman to madness, and her face distorted with rage. Sophie knew that with her statement, she had touched the most painful spot for the countess, and she enjoyed how her words had reached their target. The woman screamed in rage that the girl had fallen ill once and was now allowing herself such impudence. Sophie, without losing her composure, easily replied that she should have done it much earlier. The stepmother, with anger on her face, shouted sternly that only the attic was suitable for the girl. These words made it clear to her stepdaughter that words alone would not solve the problem. There was not the slightest regret in her eyes, and her confidence only fueled Sophie. She understood that in order to change her fate in this house, she had to act decisively and quickly. The girl thought about her plan. She decided to put pressure on her stepmother with other people's opinions. She started saying that if she went out in the street like that, everyone around would discuss her behavior, because she was not just a stepdaughter, but the Archduke's fiancé. The girl continued her thought, adding that if she went out into the street like this, everyone would immediately find out how badly she was treated in this estate. Everyone would see how she was humiliated and neglected, and this would harm the reputation of the county. Sophie was sure that such a turn of events would make her stepmother think about the consequences. However, this did not frighten the stepmother, because she knew that she had no connections among the aristocracy. She had never been to a ball, did not participate in social events, and did not have support among influential people. For the countess, such threats did not matter, and she was sure that her position in society would not suffer. Sophie felt her confidence begin to waver, thinking that perhaps she couldn't handle this situation. But suddenly a thought flashed in her head. Inside her was a time traveler who already knew how this story would end. And so, a brilliant plan began to form in her head. The girl turned to the Countess with a challenge and asked, "Do you think I can't?" The Countess, without thinking, easily answered, "Try it. Let you go out into the street and complain to some beggar." There was confidence in her voice that such threats had no meaning for the girl. The girl's brilliant plan was to publish news of her disenfranchised situation in a newspaper. She knew that even in this isolated world, people would not be able to remain indifferent to her story. And she succeeded. The article in the newspaper attracted the attention of many, and soon her case became a topic of discussion in high circles. Many people on the streets were reading the article, discussing the girl's situation. The whispers of those passing by grew louder and their glances became wary. Meanwhile, the postman continued to deliver newspapers, and each new copy only increased interest in the article. More and more people learned about the cruel treatment of the young lady, Sophie's situation warily, expressing sympathy and pity. They were whispering to each other, wondering how such an injustice could have happened to the young lady. Their eyes were filled with worry for her future, as well as a sense of discontent about how unfairly she had been treated in her own home. The newspaper reached the Countess herself. The maid approached her anxiously and reported that the article about the situation in their estate was on the front page of the weekly issue devoted to the aristocracy. The stepmother, clutching the newspaper in her hands, began to read. With each word, her face became more and more distorted, from horror and anger. The woman clutched the newspaper nervously. The Countess, with wild fury in her eyes, grabbed the newspaper and tore it into tiny pieces with force. Each torn sheet became a symbol of her anger and helplessness. She screamed, asking who dared to disgrace her in such a way, her face distorted with anger and hatred. The action moved to the headquarters of the military and police forces. The room where the meeting took place was strict and businesslike, with subdued lighting on the walls. A young man suddenly burst through the door, out of breath and with anxiety in his eyes. He exclaimed loudly, addressing his master, who was standing behind the table. The guy wanted to tell him that he was on the front page of the newspaper. The boy stopped at the door in surprise, noticing that his master was already sitting with the newspaper in his hands. He had not expected him to receive it so quickly. A little confused, the boy said that he wanted to report it, but saw that everything was already known. He looked up from his newspaper and looked at his assistant. His voice was calm. He asked why he was being written about in the newspaper without his knowledge, and how that was even possible. This man, with his truly royal bearing and influential position, was not only an archduke, but also the head of all military and police forces of the empire. Kilian Viprons Rivellon, the Archduke of the Empire who controlled the military and police forces, was the embodiment of greatness. His dark hair contrasted with his bright red eyes, and his formal suit emphasized his authority. He was always the center of attention, and everyone around him respected him for his steadfastness and strength. The assistant explained that the author of the article remained anonymous, which greatly surprised Kiliana. He looked carefully at the newspaper, turning the pages, trying to understand who could dare to write about him in such a tone. The article was well prepared and described all the events in detail, the man thought, clutching his head. He took a deep breath, trying to understand what was going on. If the source is unknown, then why didn't Lady Chenelia check this nonsense? His thoughts raced, searching for an answer. He knew that the woman couldn't help but notice such an article, especially if it was about something hype. The assistant replied that without evidence, it was impossible to take action, because any action based only on rumors could lead to wrong conclusions and undesirable consequences. Kilian, still looking thoughtfully at the newspaper, answered briefly, "Why?" Kilian paused. The assistant had noted that Lady Chenelia did not publish baseless rumors, and the man knew that was probably true. However, questions still lingered in his mind. Why, then, had insults and accusations against his stepdaughter reached the pages of newspapers? But one article may mean nothing if it is a lie, although the whole capital is already talking about it. Kilian thought, knowing that rumors can greatly affect a reputation if they are not stopped in time. While Kilian sat at his desk, looking at the newspaper, the assistant looked at him pitifully and expressed concern that people were worried about Lady Sophie. This statement made the Archduke think for a moment. He realized that public opinion could greatly affect the situation. Nick's assistant said that if you read the article carefully, the owner's name was not mentioned, and there was no direct criticism of him. This made Killian think even more. He realized that the publication could have been just a first step, but it clearly had some hidden purpose. After all, it was his fiancée who was behind this big article, albeit a little small. She wrote a lot of details about her life, making him think that she could have been deliberately using her experiences to attract attention. She clearly expected his reaction to such accusations, and this was all part of her plan. But Killian thought that this article seemed to be written to attack the county of Fraus. He looked at the paper carefully, although he had already looked at it long ago, sitting in his chair near the desk. His gaze stubbornly remained on the pages that talked about Sophie's stepmother and all the misfortunes that supposedly happened to her. And yet, looking through the newspaper, Killian saw an interesting article, which was entitled, Archduke Killian Viprons, Rivellon never visited his fiancée. He frowned, his face becoming serious. It made him wonder who could be the source of such information and for what purpose. The assistant said that some people even claimed that the Countess had killed Lady Sophie and replaced her with a similar servant. The Archduke, sitting down at the table, sighed heavily and replied that people were like animals to whom a piece of meat had been thrown. After these words, he left the newspaper on the table and closed it with a look full of displeasure. The man didn't want to create any unnecessary noise, but in fact, there was no ceremony. They simply exchanged contacts, and Sophie remained an ordinary girl to whom no one attached any importance. He didn't care, because after his parents died, the Emperor and Empress took him into their care, becoming his guardians. At the age of 6, he left his home to live and grow up in the imperial family, which became his new home. Thanks to them, he was not alone. The man became not only the brother of the crown prince, but also the second reliable son of the emperor. His place in the imperial family was secured not by blood, but by duty, because he quickly proved himself as a loyal and intelligent assistant in state affairs. Killian had not forgotten the kindness with which he had been raised, and because of this, he served the imperial family faithfully and loyally, as a long-awaited son who was always ready to guard their interests. Being who he was betrothed by the imperial family, though this union was not so much a personal choice as an obligation. The man stood up from the table with determination and began to pack, his gaze full of determination. He understood that he had to act quickly before the situation got out of control. But the assistant, noticing his movement, asked in bewilderment, "Where are you going?" He headed for the door and turned around to tell his assistant he was going to meet his fiancée. The man knew the situation with the newspaper required immediate attention, and he didn't want to let it go unnoticed. Killian decided it was time to clean up the mess and find out what was really going on. The county of Fraus did not look poor. On the contrary, it radiated luxury, and the estate was decorated with incredible taste and grandeur. The architecture, furnishings, and surrounding nature created the impression of absolute prosperity and high status. The maids whispered among themselves that the mistress had been especially angry since the morning. They were afraid to go to her, because her anger was so strong that it seemed she could burn anyone with a glance. All this happened because of an article in the newspaper which stirred up her irritation and made her show her anger to everyone around her. The maids stood in the corridor, not knowing what to do now to avoid falling under the hot hand of their mistress. They exchanged anxious glances, shuddering every time they heard a step in the house. Lady Sophie, standing behind the door, overheard their conversation. She listened curiously, feeling a slight satisfaction that the chaos caused by the newspaper article had reached their county. To her, it was proof that her words, though hidden behind the pages, had achieved their goal. Even from her attic, she could hear it. This is a classic cliché of romantic stories, where the time traveler, regardless of her status, becomes the center of events. In this type of story, her every action has great significance because her presence changes everything around her. Whether she is the main heroine, a powerful villain, or even a servant, her actions begin to influence the fates of others. As the Archduke's fiancée, she became an important figure, and her actions could now influence public opinion. As a time traveler, she knew that every step she took had major consequences, and news of her situation would inevitably reach the capital, influencing her future. The girl stood by the window, enjoying the view of people discussing the events related to the newspaper. She felt proud of herself, because she knew that her intervention had caused this discussion. She had skillfully manipulated the information, inflating the situation, and now everyone was involved in her game. With every word, she felt satisfaction. The girl folded her arms across her chest, smiling to herself, enjoying the feeling of victory. In her head, the ringing echo of her thought was already ringing. The entire capital knows. She realized how masterfully she had managed to turn the situation to her advantage, and even if the county of Frowes was worried about the opinions of others, she now had to be especially careful. Sophie paused, looking back at how things were unfolding. She knew that not all solutions came quickly, and she might have to be patient. Although her life had become a topic of discussion, it was time for her fiancé to get moving. Sophie was tired of having all the decisions about their future dependent on her alone. He was clearly dragging his feet, and she wasn't going to wait forever. Time was not standing still. Near a large estate of the county of Frowes, its exquisite appearance attracted attention, as if luxury itself was contained in its form and details. The wooden wheels gleamed in the light, and the dark upholstery hid the richness inside. The servants came out to the carriage and bowed, greeting its arrivals with due respect. Each gesture was filled with impeccable grace, as if they were already accustomed to the grandeur that accompanied their daily lives. The Archduke stepped out of the carriage. Sophie, who was standing by the window, saw him and was very surprised. It was unexpected. She had not expected him to arrive so quickly. His majestic posture, his royal manner, everything in his behavior spoke of power and status. She was delighted, because for a moment it seemed to her that it was her fiancé who stepped out of the carriage. With slight excitement, she looked closely, hoping that it was he. He looked amazing. He was the man of her dreams. He wore a very charming cliché that matched his appearance perfectly. His black hair, so black that it seemed part of the night itself, and his eyes, red as rubies, sparkled in the rays of the setting sun. He moved with grace, as if the very air obeyed his presence. It was the image of a lonely man, and the girl felt a pang in her chest from his gaze alone. His eyes reflected the emptiness hidden behind the external grandeur. He was handsome, but there was also some deep loneliness in it that could not help but touch Sophie. The appearance was not surprising because it was the standard of the main character, a jealous, dark-haired Archduke of the North. His image perfectly fit into the typical ideas about such a character, strong and attractive. But Sophie happily thought that she rated his face at 10 points. There was harmony in his features. The girl joyfully cried out that they had to break off the engagement because then he would definitely fall in love with her, and finally the real plot would begin. She already imagined how her life would turn into a novel filled with passion and adventure. True, she did not know what kind of novella she found herself in. The parents immediately ran out to greet the Archduke. They were in a hurry, realizing that their daughter was living in the attic, and they couldn't let him see it. Everything had to look perfect, because the visit of such an important guest required perfection in everything. Panic seized them a little, but they quickly pulled themselves together, trying to hide all the flaws. The girl's father said wearily that if the boy had warned them, they would have been prepared and not rushed. He sounded exhausted, as if all this unexpected commotion had been too much for him. The woman next to him was trying to catch her breath, her face pale, her breathing ragged. She was trying not to show that she was too tense. The man glared at them and said that he wanted to meet his fiancée. "Does that need a reason?" he added, his voice full of irritation. It seemed that his patience had snapped, and now he was not going to waste time on empty explanations or apologies. His gaze was sharp and determined. The parents, irritated and unsure of what to do, looked at him in confusion. Many thoughts were racing through their heads, but none seemed good enough. They knew they had to somehow delay him, at least for a little while, so they could get their daughter cleaned up and perhaps move her to another room. Time was against them. The girl had been watching all this from the window. She was admiring the man, unable to tear her eyes away. Even from here, it was clear that he was the main male character in this story. His confidence, his demeanor, even his gaze, all of this betrayed his leadership role. Sophie felt her heart beating faster, and she wanted to be near him. He was an archduke, holding a high position in society. His eyes showed strength and confidence, and his connections with the crown prince only emphasized the importance of his position. But the best thing was that Killian was a fair and well-mannered man. He did not run after women, and his respect for them was genuine, without falsehood or games. The girl had heard that many aristocratic women liked the Archduke, although he was not interested in them at all. He was too high-ranking to pay attention to society gossip or courtship. Despite this, his attention was valuable to many women who dreamed of his favor. But for Killian, such games did not matter. But this man made the girl think. She liked him madly. Everything about him attracted her, from his confidence to the way he held himself in any situation. His presence seemed to fill the air with something special, and she could not help but admire him. His cold but fair manner of communication only increased her interest. She was happy, because fortunately, this was her fiancé. Everything inside her was filled with happiness and excitement. The very man who made her think was so close to her, and now that he was near, her feelings only intensified. This was not just an ideal. This was her choice, and she felt that their future was just beginning. She looked out the window and noticed that he was looking at her too. Their eyes met, and at that moment, time seemed to stop. Everything around disappeared, leaving only their two gazes, full of unexpressed feelings and thoughts. Sophie felt her heart beat faster. She realized that they were looking at each other and blushed. Embarrassment enveloped her, and at that moment she felt her cheeks fill with heat. She quickly looked away from the window in another direction, trying to hide her awkwardness. Her head was a mess of thoughts, and her heart continued to beat faster. But when she realized that she had broken their eye contact, she panicked, even though she had done nothing wrong. Doubts flashed in her mind. Everything inside her was rushing, but she tried to calm down, although the feeling of awkwardness did not go away. She was brought out of her thoughts by the maid Jenny, who burst into the room, opening the door with a dress and shoes in her hands. This greatly surprised the girl, and she immediately felt her heart slow down a little from the unexpectedness. Jenny, not paying attention to her surprised face, began to shout for the mistress to get ready. The maid, noticing how the girl hesitated, asked in surprise, "Are you going to meet the groom like this?" These words took the bride by surprise. Sophie had not had time to prepare, and now that the maid pointed out her careless appearance, she felt awkward. Panic began inside. How could she have forgotten herself so much and not been ready to meet him? The maid asked her mistress to change her clothes, and Sophie thought that this was done especially for the meeting with the Archduke. She realized that there should be due respect for his bride, because any unworthy attitude towards her was equated with an insult to Kiliana, which the maids and her parents could not allow. The girl, slightly embarrassed, asked if she should dress herself. The maid teasingly answered, "Do you want me to help you?" Her voice sounded playful, with a barely noticeable mockery, as if she was making fun of her mistress. This question was unexpected for Sophie, and her cheeks slightly blushed from such directness of the maid. She asked if the maid was sure she could fix herself. The maid answered with fire in her eyes, literally burning with anger. Her gaze was so bright that Sophie felt the tension in the air for a moment. The girl lifted her dress and said with confidence, "The Archduke will definitely like it." She looked at herself in the mirror and thought, "Perhaps if I leave my back open." There was a light play and self-confidence in her words, although inside there was still a little uncertainty. She was looking forward to the meeting. The maid angrily tightened the dress on the beautiful girl, Sophie, causing her to groan and cry out in pain. The fabric wrapped tightly around her, and the maid seemed not to notice how tightly she was tightening it. There was not the slightest hint of compassion in her. The girl, wincing in pain, said with difficulty, turning to Jenny, "Be careful, I'm not made of iron." But the maid did not stop, only tightened the dress tighter, not paying attention to her words. "Rejoice, mistress," she said with a cold smile. "If the dress is too loose, everyone will see the scar on your back." The girl looked in the mirror, trying to see the scar that the maid had spoken of. This information surprised her because she had not expected the scar to be so noticeable. Sophie peered at her back, trying to discern traces of the past that seemed to remain with her forever. Thoughts swarmed in her head. Lifting her dress, the girl was horrified to see a large scar. Her heart sank with disgust and surprise. What a terrible childhood the heroine must have had if the aristocrat had such a stain on her past. Sophie felt how uneasy she became that this scar could reveal her hidden pains and experiences. The maid pushed her chair back nervously and angrily, and then, with obvious irritation, said, "Sit down. I'll do your hair." Her words sounded with a hint of aggression, as if everything that was happening irritated her. Sophie, feeling the tension, sat down obediently, but a shadow of displeasure flashed in her eyes from the maid's harshness. She thought that she looked terrible, despite the fact that today was her first meeting with the main character. Her thoughts were confused, and despite all her efforts to tidy herself up, she could not get rid of the feeling that something was wrong. The maid informed her mistress that she was finished, and Sophie finally looked at herself in the mirror. The girl really did look wonderful. The dress perfectly emphasized her green eyes, and her hair was styled in such a way that it seemed even thicker and shinier. She couldn't help but admire her reflection, feeling her confidence slowly return. The girl looked in the mirror and could not contain her admiration. She really did look like a real aristocrat. Every detail of her image was impeccable, and she felt her confidence grow. She was really lucky because she was engaged to the Archduke, a man who was respected in society. She turned around and saw the angry maid, who was literally squealing with anger. Her face was distorted with rage, and her eyes were blazing, as if she was ready to spill all the pent-up frustration. With each passing second, her anger became more and more obvious, and Sophie felt the tension in the air grow. The maid, almost holding back her anger, said that the girl was ready and asked her to come out quickly. The mistress's old things were scattered around the room, creating a mess, while Sophie sat on a chair, in no hurry to get up. She was a little overwhelmed by all the fuss and tension, but she understood that she needed to be ready for the meeting. The maid, heading for the door, added insistently, "His Highness is waiting." But as soon as she said these words, Sophie did not even have time to realize how the Archduke was already in the doorway. He stood there as if he had appeared instantly, his presence immediately filling the room. His gaze was focused. The maid was about to leave, but when she looked up, she suddenly came across the chest of a young man, which immediately frightened her. She raised her eyes higher and saw the very same Archduke of the North in front of her. His tall figure, confident posture, and icy gaze made her momentarily confused. He stood right by the door, as if he had always been there. The man looked around the room, his gaze hardening as he realized that the article was true after all. He turned slowly to the maid and, giving her a cold, cruel look, said, "You're late." His words sounded like a death sentence, and the tense silence in the room heightened the effect of his presence. The bride watched all this with surprise, unable to understand what exactly was happening. While the maid, visibly confused, tried to justify herself, her words sounded unconvincing and nervous. She explained her actions, but the Archduke's gaze remained cold and unyielding, which made her even more worried. The girl was surprised because she did not expect him to get to the attic so quickly. The Archduke always went for broke, but this was too much. She could not understand how he could have ended up here in her room so quickly, and what made him act so decisively. With each passing moment, the tension only increased. The Count and Countess tried to hide from the young man that his fiancé lived in the attic, but how did he find out? The girl was a little embarrassed because he just burst in without warning, as if he knew all her secrets. This caused Sophie to feel awkward and uncertain. The girl, trying to seem as indifferent as possible, said that one shouldn't barge in on women and that he was very rude. She knew that men didn't like such remarks, but she couldn't help herself. Her tone betrayed a slight embarrassment, and her cheeks began to turn a telltale pink. The boy looked at the girl tenderly and, slightly bowing his head, asked for forgiveness. He explained that the door had opened before he entered, so it was not his fault. His soft tone and calmness made the girl relax a little. Meanwhile, the maid, standing nearby, silently watched what was happening, carefully listening to every word. The man looked around the attic, his gaze sliding over the dirty walls, dusty shelves, and cobwebs hanging in the corners. His expression darkened, and contempt flashed in his eyes. Calmly but firmly, he said that he could not call this place his bride's room. His words sounded firm, and the atmosphere in the room became gloomy. The maid became worried. The girl, trying to hide her embarrassment, asked the man how he had ended up there. She added that the maids would never have allowed him to enter the attic. There was bewilderment in her voice, mixed with slight irritation, because his appearance seemed almost impossible to her. The Archduke only watched his bride. Killian nodded affirmatively, confirming the girl's words, and turned his gaze to the maid standing nearby. His eyes flashed coldly, and without changing his even tone, he said that he would like to speak with his bride alone. His words sounded like an order, leaving no room for objections. He added that he felt as if they were being disturbed, and hoped that his words had been understood. There was a hidden threat in his voice that made the maid stand still, alarmed. She did not dare to take her eyes off the Archduke, her face expressing a mixture of surprise and fear. The maid, having come to her senses from his words and heavy gaze, turned sharply and almost ran out of the attic, descending the stairs. Her hurried steps and the light creak of the wooden steps sounded in the silence of the room, leaving behind a feeling of awkwardness and tension. When the couple was alone, the man calmly asked again if he could come in, even though he was already standing in the room. His question sounded so unexpected that the girl was taken aback for a moment. She looked at him with slight bewilderment, trying to figure out whether it was a joke or a challenge, but said nothing, preferring not to escalate the situation. The girl, feeling uneasy, asked if the place really seemed so terrible. The Archduke briefly confirmed that it was, in a level and cold tone as she expected. His directness made her think. He clearly did not waste words, which both delighted and alarmed her. He sat down on the only chair in the room and, looking at the girl, asked if she had read Lady Chanelia's newspaper. Sophie, sitting on the bed, was a little embarrassed and replied that she had not read it, but had heard of it. She wondered why he was interested in this question and felt a slight tension. He lowered his eyes and, slightly bowing his head, told the girl that there were rumors everywhere that she was a servant. He added that he did not know who wrote this in the newspaper and with what intention, but such rumors had already spread. His words sounded neutral, but there was a hidden tension in his voice. The girl held her breath, trying to hide her inner embarrassment. She knew that she was the source of these rumors. After a short silence and reflection, she made up her mind and, gathering her strength, told the man that it was her article in the newspaper. Her voice wavered, but she still said these words, feeling how awkwardness filled the room. The man tensed up. His gaze became much sterner, and his expression became more wary. He did not quite understand the girl's actions, so he decided to ask again to understand the situation exactly. But despite his doubts, she only confirmed his words, feeling how her words became a heavy burden. Killian looked at the girl and asked with slight irritation why she had done that. Sophie replied that he himself saw the situation she was in, and she would very much like to change the situation. Her voice sounded sincere, but there was also anxiety and despair in it, as if she was looking for a way out but did not know how to find it. The girl thought about it after hearing his question. She wasn't sure if that was why she had mentioned her husband's name. There was no answer in her head, and she didn't know what to say. The whole situation seemed more and more confusing to her, and it was difficult for her to find words that could somehow relieve the tension. Sophie, having pulled herself together a little, told the man that the article with the headline, "Poor Sophia Fraus lives in the attic," would never have been read if she hadn't attracted attention in this way. Her words sounded with a note of justification, as if she was looking for a reason why she had acted this way and not otherwise. Sophie thought that the aristocrats did not know her, but literally everyone should know the Archduke of the North. He was the most attractive man in the empire, and this, of course, should have caused a lot of rumors. And what was the girl's solution to stand out in the era of information overload? That's right, only provocation. Sophie realized that in order to be noticed in this sea of rumors and news, she had to do something loud and unexpected, even if it was not the best choice. The man thoughtfully asked the girl if that was why she had decided to tell him she had been made a servant. His gaze was intense, and he seemed to be trying to figure out whether her provocation was part of some deeper strategy or just a random move in search of attention. The girl knew that this action could ruin his reputation, but it was his punishment for ignoring his fiancé. She smiled and said that because of this article, she finally managed to meet her fiancé. There was a slight mockery in her voice, but also some satisfaction that, despite everything, her plan worked. The girl looked at the floor with pity and quietly added that she hoped that these rumors would make her family change. There was pain in her voice, as if she expected them to finally see her, understand her needs, and change their attitude. She looked at the boy with a smile and said that his father had to prove to everyone that she was not a servant, and if he wanted their engagement to survive, he would have to correct this misunderstanding. There was confidence in her words, but also a slight mockery, as if she was leaving him a choice of what to do next. The man, hearing these words, thought deeply and was surprised. He did not expect that the girl would dare to provoke him in such a way, and now he had to rethink the situation. His gaze became more serious, and doubt appeared in his eyes as to how exactly he should act to resolve this conflict. He asked her what she would do if he heard about it and wanted to break off the engagement. His voice was calm, but there was a certain tension in it, as if he was really ready to take such a step. He watched her reaction, trying to figure out how she would react to such a possibility. The girl smiled and said that there was nothing to be done then, we would have to break it off. She was in a great mood, as if this situation could not shake her, and even the thought of breaking off the engagement did not cause her any particular concern. Her confidence and serenity were almost noticeable. The man folded his arms and looked at the girl in surprise. He certainly hadn't expected such an answer. His face became more serious. He studied her with interest, trying to understand what was behind her calmness. He expected her to be worried, but her confidence only added to the mystery of the whole situation. He looked at the girl a little worriedly and asked if she was serious. His gaze was wary, as if trying to figure out if there was something more hidden behind her calm. He didn't know what to think of her reaction. She was too sure for it to be just a joke. The girl said innocently that if this happened, she could be thrown out onto the roof or straight into the street. Her words sounded so easy, as if she had long since resigned herself to the possibility of such an outcome. There was no fear in her tone, only a calm acceptance of reality. She saw his anxiety. He was a strong Archduke of the North, but when he saw a helpless girl in front of him, he became much more vulnerable. It was standard behavior for such men. Their confidence disappeared when they were faced with something they could not control or understand. The man didn't know what to answer her, so he looked around the room, his eyes darting in different directions, trying to find some escape from the awkwardness of the situation. His gaze moved from the old things to the window, but neither place could hide his confusion. He straightened up and continued to think about what to do. He understood the girl's situation, and he felt sorry for her. But despite his cruelty and confidence, at that moment he felt some helplessness, as if for the first time he had encountered something that he could not change so easily. The girl decided to break the silence and asked if he wanted to break off the engagement, adding that he should warn her in advance. She looked at him with a slight expression of expectation, ready to accept his decision, but still hoping that her words would find a response in his heart. After all, the girl could be kicked out of the house and she needed to prepare. He asked again, and the girl confirmed. She would have to sell all the valuables she owned to survive without her family's support. This was her reality. Cold and cruel, but she was already prepared for any outcome. She added that she also needed to check if she had any land. The man listened to her story with horror, realizing how difficult and helpless her path had been. He could not imagine how a girl in her situation could speak so calmly about a future that looked so bleak. Sophie knew he thought of her as a very sophisticated aristocrat. This was bound to surprise Killian, and everything she did was calculated to provoke that reaction. She knew how to play by the rules, knowing how to handle the expectations placed on her as a member of the nobility. The man rubbed his temples and said with a heavy heart that he wasn't even thinking about ending the marriage. The girl knew it. He wanted to scare her because she had decided to take a bold step by publishing an article, but it seemed that it wouldn't work with her. His confidence seemed like a test to her, but she wasn't afraid. The girl knew what he was thinking. If he scolded her, she would immediately become obedient. But she was ready for this, and was not going to let his words subjugate her. She understood that his attempts to keep her in line were just a way to regain control, and she was not going to give in. Inside her, there was joy for her heroine, a time traveler who was able to survive in the cruel modern world. This world was full of dangers and trials, but her determination and ability to adapt gave her the strength to move forward. He continued to ask persistently what would happen if the rumor got out of hand, since it would be difficult to prove that she was not a servant. He understood that in an aristocratic society, such rumors could spread quickly, and it would be difficult to restore honor or reputation. The girl got out of bed with ease and joy on her face, feeling confident and ready for new challenges. Her gaze was determined and her steps were full of confidence. The guy sat on a chair, crossed his arms, and with a cold look asked if she would admit that she had deceived everyone. She, without changing the joy on her face, calmly answered that no, because if she confessed, there would be no living place left on her. The room became increasingly stuffy from the tense atmosphere. She walked up to the table, placed her palm on a beautiful little envelope of soft pink color, and continued her speech. In a calm voice, she said that all the people in this estate knew that she was performing the duties of a servant. There was not a drop of regret in her words, only confidence that her role was not as important as it might seem. She added that therefore everyone could confirm that the article was true. There was no fear or doubt in her voice, only a calm confidence in her words, as if she had discussed this with those around her more than once. She picked up the envelope, rubbing it gently between her fingers, and happily admitted that it had been easy to publish a story she had received from an anonymous source. There was a casualness in her voice, as if she had just shared an insignificant detail rather than a revelation that could change everything. The man thought about it because he always thought of his bride as a simple girl, not familiar with the cruel realities of this world. However, now he realized that he was wrong. She surprised him by showing that she could play this game no worse than he could, and even manipulate the situation to her advantage. The girl sat back down on the bed, her gaze calm. The guy, noticing her reaction, smiled and with slight sarcasm said that he had heard completely different information about her. Sophie, slightly tilting her head, curiously asked what exactly he knew about her, expecting that the answer might not be what she assumed. The man described her as weak, hesitant, and fearful. His words sounded heavy, and she felt his gaze penetrating her inner world. The girl tried to hide her displeasure behind a happy smile. Sophia smiled and said that was a pretty good description of the girl who lived in the attic. She said it with a hint of irony, but there was something more in her eyes, a determination that she herself had not yet realized, the girl thought, because perhaps the real heroine was like this, weak, indecisive, and fearful. However, deep down, she knew that these features were just masks hiding her true strength. Perhaps she was just beginning to realize who she really was. Her heroine probably wouldn't have resisted the maid Jenny, even if she had brought her soup with flies. Everything in her life would have been taken for granted, and perhaps she would have come to terms with it. However, the traveler felt that she was capable of more, and she was not going to give up. And most likely, in such favorable conditions, a person cannot be healthy. The constant struggle with the surrounding injustice, limited resources, and depression from continuous humiliation, all this would affect any person. The girl did not want the heroine's life to continue exactly like this. The girl smiled tenderly at the Archduke, and her eyes literally shone. She said with confidence that she hoped that he would like her true nature without masks and tricks, because she did not strive to be anyone else. The man stood up from his chair. His face became serious, and he said that he understood everything now. The girl froze, not understanding his intentions. Her heart sank, and she could not shake off the disturbing thought. Was he really going to leave without explaining what would happen next? The man stepped closer and stood directly in front of the girl. She looked up to meet his eyes. His face was serious and his voice was stern as he said, "This place is not for you." His words sounded like a sentence, and the girl felt a cold wave wash over her. She had not expected this turn of events. He gently took her hand, squeezed her fingers softly, and looking into her eyes, asked, "Come with me." The girl was shocked. This unexpected gesture amazed her, and she did not know what to say or how to react. Everything that was happening seemed so impossible and unpredictable that she felt confused. They walked down the stairs, but the silence was broken by her father's sharp voice. Sophie stopped, her heart pounding harder and anxiety rising in her chest. She didn't know what to expect. He could react in many ways, with anger or despair, and every word he said could change the course of events. The father called out anxiously, asking where he was taking his daughter. His voice was full of worry, and his eyes darted around in surprise. The stepmother stood behind him, her face clearly worried, unable to comprehend what was happening. The father, still full of anxiety, said that he and the Archduke had not even spoken, had not discussed any details. He tried to make sense of what was happening, but he clearly could not understand the man's intentions. However, the Archduke, without losing his composure, answered calmly that he had already spoken with his bride. His words were confident. The parents, seeing the Archduke's confidence and realizing that their daughter had already openly communicated with him, began to panic. The father spoke anxiously, trying to hide his anxiety. His voice trembled, and every step he took showed how nervous he was. The stepmother, standing nearby, also could not hide her anxiety. Her gaze was full of excitement. The man, with a slight sweat on his forehead from nervous tension, looked at the Archduke and, stuttering a little, said that he did not know what his daughter could have said. His voice trembled with anxiety, and he clearly did not know how the situation would develop. The Archduke looked at his bride's father with an icy gaze and, without hiding his displeasure, asked what he wanted to tell him. His voice was even, but there was a hidden threat in it, like that of a man accustomed to power and control. My father began to shout that today's article was a lie, that it was all complete nonsense. His face was red with anger and stress, and his hands were clutching the air, as if trying to push away the very idea that anyone could believe these conjectures. He was ready to fight for his honor, despite the obvious tension in the room. For some reason, Father stepped closer to the Archduke, but no one paid attention to this gesture. The tension in the air became almost tangible. Everyone knew that any wrong step could lead to unpredictable consequences. The couple descended the stairs and stood before the bride's parents. The Archduke, with cold determination, informed them that he hoped they would do everything in their power to wash their family clean of this disgrace. The father and stepmother only looked at each other in surprise, unsure how to respond to such a threat. The boy came closer to the bride's father and, smiling, asked with cold insistence, "If this rumor is not true, then why was my bride in the maid's quarters?" His voice was calm. The girl's parents felt the tension in the air grow and were silent for a moment, not knowing what to say. The boy added, with obvious anger in his voice, that they should have taken care to avoid such a misunderstanding. He raised an eyebrow at the girl's parents and said firmly, "Isn't this a disgrace to your family?" His words hung in the air, as if everyone in the room realized the seriousness of what was happening. The father, with horror in his eyes, could not hide his guilt and with difficulty confirmed his words. He realized that he had just made an unforgivable mistake, having witnessed how he himself had subjected his family to shame in front of the Archduke. The Archduke, looking resolutely at his parents, said that he needed to be alone with his bride and promised to take care of her dinner. His voice was full of confidence and cold determination. The girl stood, a little dumbfounded, watching the reaction of her parents. Their faces expressed anxiety and confusion. The Archduke turned to the girl's parents and said with cold determination, "When we return, I hope I will not have to take her back to the attic." His words were sharp and full of contempt, leaving the parents confused and at a loss. The girl froze in amazement, because his words were not just a threat, but an urgent warning for her parents to change their attitude towards her. It was important and pleasant for her, as if for the first time someone had seriously noticed her merits and determination, and not just the situation she found herself in. The last time the girl asked for a room, she had been slapped in the face, and the Archduke did not have to repeat his words. He knew that her request was important, and now that he had intervened, everything was going to change. The man looked at the girl tenderly, his gaze full of regret. He understood her pain and wanted to show that he was capable of being not only strict, but also caring. This was the moment when he could show his true side and support her in this difficult moment. He offered her his hand, and she, with slight hesitation, placed hers in his, accepting the gesture. A spark of trust flickered in her eyes, as if at that moment she felt that she was not entirely alone in this world. The girl watched all this in amazement, unable to believe that everything had worked out so well. Her heart beat faster, and despite her fears and doubts, she felt hope for a future that now seemed less frightening. The man addressed her again with tenderness in his voice, adding that now no one would disturb them. "Let's go," he said, holding out his hand, and there was a confidence in his words that gave the girl hope that everything would be fine. The girl admired his manners, which were surprisingly natural and relaxed. It made her feel special, and goosebumps ran down her skin from such an attentive and warm attitude, as expected, because this man was the main character, the embodiment of strength and determination. But at the same time, his attention and care for her showed a completely different side of his personality, one that she did not expect to see. The beautiful couple got into the same carriage that Killian had originally arrived in. The light rustle of their dresses and the quiet creak of the wheels seemed to add even more comfort and silence to that moment when they were hidden in its upholstery. And the world outside the window seemed so distant and insignificant. Sophie, looking at her fiancé, asked with interest where they were going. She liked this unexpected turn of events, and the feeling that everything now depended only on them filled her with joy and excitement. The man answered her question calmly. They were heading to the studio. His voice was confident and his gaze was soft, which gave Sophie confidence because she understood that with this man one could expect only reliability and care. The girl thought, trying to understand what was hidden behind this word. And with hope in her eyes, she expected that it would be some beautiful, amazing place where she could feel safe and, perhaps, see another side of the world that she did not yet know about. She realized that her life was gradually turning into a fairy tale, and this filled her with insane happiness. The thought that they were going to the studio filled her with joy and delight, because it promised something extraordinary, as if the world had finally begun to reveal its best sides to her. The trip to the studio was the main event of all the stories, a moment that always foreshadowed something important and exciting. For the girl, it was like a symbol of a new stage in her life, and joy overwhelmed her because she could not help but notice how unusual and significant this moment was for her. The atelier is a place where people buy expensive and fashionable clothes. Here, our groom, according to the standards, must tell the girl that he buys everything. It was a wonderful opportunity for the girl to dress up, to feel like a part of the luxurious world she dreamed of. At such moments, she could forget about the difficulties she had to endure and enjoy the moment when everything around her became magical. The girl was in anticipation and was looking forward to finally having the opportunity to try on luxurious dresses. Thoughts about how she would look in these exquisite outfits made her heart beat faster. The girl accidentally expressed her thoughts out loud, saying that she felt like she was in a theme park. The man was very surprised and did not quite understand these words. He sat silently and watched the happy girl, his gaze full of warmth and attention. He saw her face shining with joy, and it made his heart beat faster. The man was in some kind of thought. The man thought about it watching her. Just a moment ago, she had sat on a chair in the attic, looking so different. Bold, confident, almost aloof. He couldn't help but wonder how she had changed so quickly. And now she looked like a happy puppy, looking out the window, waiting to finally get out of that carriage. Her face was glowing with joy, and her eyes were sparkling with anticipation, as if she couldn't wait to enter a new world full of possibilities and wonders. The girl, looking out the window, was amazed by what she saw. A large cart, harnessed to white horses, was slowly moving along the road, and people in beautiful and elegant clothes were walking around, creating an atmosphere of luxury and wealth. Everything seemed so new and unusual to her, and she could not help but admire this bright and unusual world. The man watched her, realizing that she was truly in the capital for the first time. She, in turn, was curiously looking at the shop windows outside the window, and her expression showed how genuinely surprised she was. In her mind, she probably assumed that they sold desserts there, like in the manoir. The man watched the girl with interest and a soft smile, admiring her naivety and sincere joy. This side of her personality, full of delight and surprise, was especially attractive to him.